Am I in the middle? Or...
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Just because I'm on the side.
Hey, how are you? How's it going? Yeah, good to see you again. Good.
Well, good evening. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm Ivo Dollar, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Our program tonight has an uneasy timeliness. No issue today seems more at a tipping point than the Iran nuclear deal, although we were just talking about nuclear weapons in North Korea before, which is pretty timely too, given the president's trip to Asia. But we're going to stick to Iran, and maybe in the Q&A we will have a little bit of conversation about North Korea as well. I'm really pleased today to be joined here in Chicago by two of our great experts to help try to make sense of the situation with regard to Iran. Jessica Matthews is a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where prior to that she served as the president of the institution for 18 years. She's worked both on the executive and legislative branches, including the National Security Council and the State Department, where she focused on issues like climate and energy, security, and nuclear weapons. Michael Singh is the Lane Swig Senior Fellow and Managing Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. During the George W. Bush administration, he was responsible for devising and coordinating national security policy in the Middle East and North Africa, with a particular emphasis on Iran's nuclear and regional activities. He also was the Mideast advisor to Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. We are thrilled to have both of you here with us tonight. A few brief housekeeping remarks. Views expressed by individuals on the platform are their own, and they, of course, do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Chicago Council. We're on the record. We're live streaming. So if you please can silence your phones, or better yet, turn them off completely, unless you would like to participate in our social media discussion online, and you'll have the details on the screen at the site. Later, we will take audience questions directly from the room, and if you are watching online through the webpage chi.cnf.io. Following the program, please join us for a networking reception from 6:30 to 7 p.m. Jessica, Michael, thanks for being here. Let me start with some recent public opinion polling data that we collected. The Council polled earlier this year the American public and found that 6 in 10, that's 62%, say that, quote, the possibility of any new countries, friendly or unfriendly, acquiring nuclear weapons is a critical threat to the United States. Just below terrorism and cyber attacks, but an even greater majority of Americans are concerned about North Korea's nuclear program. 75% of Americans think that the North Korean program is a critical threat. Now, when we last asked a question about Iran in 2015, 57% of Americans described Iran's nuclear program as a critical threat. In other words, the American public is deeply concerned about nuclear weapons, particularly in the hands of countries like North Korea and Iran. The Iran deal is now entering its third year. While the Trump administration has been concerned, as indeed the Obama administration was before the Trump administration, about Iran's behavior in the region, the International Atomic Energy Agency, supported by the European allies, Russia and China, has determined that the Iran agreement is working, that there is no violation by Iran of its terms. So let me start by that question. Michael, let me start with you. Is the deal working so far?
I think we can say, Ivo, and first of all, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be at the Chicago Council. It's a pleasure to be in Chicago. I'm a Chicago native, and so I always appreciate the chance to come back, and so thanks for inviting me. I think what we can say is that all sides are complying with the deal. The IAEA has said that now many times. As far as I know, the Trump administration hasn't disputed that. The Iranians have occasionally accused the United States of not complying, but I think that other states have suggested that no, in fact, we are. We've extended the sanctions relief that we promised we would. I think the deeper question, though, and the one which is really sort of at issue with this new policy is the deal working to do what it was set out to do? And that is, first and foremost, to prevent Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon. That's an objective which President Obama, President Bush, President Trump, I think, have shared, and as you suggested, Ivo, is one that's shared by the American people as well. And then secondarily, has it led to any kind of thawing between the United States and Iran, which, while maybe not the point of the deal, was certainly something that President Obama hoped for? On that score, I think we can say, on the latter score, I think we can say absolutely not. We see that Iran has expanded its power in the Middle East, and there is no thawing, there is certainly no reconciliation evident between the United States and Iran. And I imagine people will give different reasons for why that is. Certainly Americans and Iranians would give different reasons for why that is. When it comes to preventing Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon, I think obviously that's a controversial question. And I think those who are critics of the deal would say that, in fact, what this deal has done is it's bought time, not just for the United States, but for Iran. And in fact, what we're concerned about, and I think what the Trump administration is concerned about, and people who were critical in 2015 during the original debate, which hopefully we won't have to rehash, is that it just kicks the can down the road, that we'll be dealing with this problem again come 8 to 10 years from now, and that it's not really solved in a sustainable way.
Jessica, you see it the same way in terms of whether the deal is working so far, both in terms of I think the terms that Michael laid out in terms of the nuclear dimension and the regional dimension. Is that the right way to look at it? And if so, do you share Michael's judgment?
Well, I certainly agree that the deal has not improved the relations between the U.S. and Iran. That's inarguable. I think the important or the most relevant conclusion from that is that Iran's greater power in the region has nothing whatever to do with this deal. It has to do with the fact that we removed Iran's two greatest enemies, the Taliban and Saddam Hussein, and that we fought at least in tacit parallel against ISIS, and that Iran has been able to take advantage of areas of chaos in the region. All three issues, there's no question. But the important issue for this discussion, I think, is it because of the deal? And the answer there, I think, is unequivocally no. On the question of whether it's working and what was the purpose of the deal, the purpose was that Iran was a threshold nuclear state in 2013. It was perhaps 4 weeks away from having a critical mass of nuclear weapons fuel, and it is now at least a year away, probably more. I think that's a major achievement. I think we have indeed bought time, but I think of that in a positive way. If we can't build on this agreement in the, I would say, 13 years that we have, that's on us. Many things will change in that time. The revolutionary generation in Iran will be gone, just for reasons of age. The next generation is more secular, better educated, eager to get out of international isolation and to use the skills that they have. So that, I've heard people say, oh, 13 years is a blink of an eye. It isn't. It's a long time to build on what is a very substantial achievement. I don't think it's wise to belittle what Iran gave up here. They got rid of all their highly enriched uranium, 20%, which is far along towards weapons grade. They got rid of 97% of their low enriched uranium. They got rid permanently of their only plutonium production reactor. They took the amount of heavy water down to a non-threatening level and have kept it there under the agreement. They've shut down enrichment at one of their two facilities, at the underground one, which is relatively immune to bombing. They did a great deal. They didn't do everything. We weren't negotiating with a defeated enemy, an enemy that had been defeated on the battlefield. We were negotiating with an adversary that was weeks away from a nuclear weapons capability. And I think put in that light what this agreement has achieved, on which there's no disagreement between us, there is more work to be done, is very substantial.
So before we go where we are today and where we move forward, there are two issues, and Michael, I have one comment on what Jessica said, but there are two issues, without necessarily getting into the deep details of the agreement, that I think are important. One is, you said 8 to 10 years. Jessica, you said 13 to 15 years. Time is important, so can we figure out what is it, or where is the agreement to either to disagree or why it is that we're agreeing is one of it. And then secondly, I'd love to hear, Jessica, particularly from you, what steps should we take between, whether it's the next 8 years or the next 13 years, that if you stay within the agreement would prolong whatever that time period is. But Michael,
so your first question, Ivo, was about just clarifying the timeline?
Clarify the timeline. You say 8 to 10, Jessica says 13 to 15, but also whether the larger point, which I think Jessica's making, is we were very close to Iran achieving sufficient capability for a nuclear weapon, and it has given up a lot. Maybe it didn't give up enough, and that's where the timeline gets into the question.
Ivo, there's as you know, you've served in government, there's an artificiality to a lot of these conversations, because I think what we talk about, well, Iran was a few weeks away from a nuclear weapon. We talk about the sort of possibility of war between the U.S. and Iran. My own analysis then and now is that Iran was not going to build a nuclear weapon at that time, because it would have been extraordinarily dangerous for Iran to, using these facilities we knew about, to suddenly try to make a nuclear weapon. The most precarious situation for Iran would be to have one sort of nuclear weapon without a long-range missile with which to fire it, especially now that we're looking at North Korea and wishing we sort of had that situation back with them. At the same time, I don't think that President Obama was about to go to war with Iran. I think that part of the reason he did this deal was that he was trying to avert that outcome and saw that outcome as probably the worst case scenario. So there's a bit of an artificiality about this. What should we really worry about? From my point of view, what we should really worry about is Iran clandestinely making multiple nuclear weapons, because I think that is the only route that makes sense for Iran to become a nuclear-armed state. To do that, they would need to have a hidden enrichment or reprocessing facility, probably enrichment, I think, because reprocessing is, for technical reasons, harder. They would need to have the ability to take highly enriched uranium, which they haven't currently made to the degree they would need to, and turn that into a warhead, turn that into a usable weapon. And then they'd have to be able to mount that weapon atop probably an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, if they wanted to deter the United States. So what we should be worried about is first stopping them from having a clandestine enrichment facility, which means hopefully stopping them from having either stopping them from having the centrifuges they'd use for such a facility, which would probably be advanced, very efficient centrifuges, so you just need a small number of them, or having sufficient intelligence, having sufficient sort of eyes on what was happening in Iran to stop that reliably. We'd want to know that they weren't resuming their weaponization work, and we'd want to stop them, hopefully, from producing and testing that kind of long-range or intercontinental ballistic missile. And so I think as we think about not just this agreement, but what should we be doing going forward, those are the different parts that we need to have our eyes on. And so as you talk about the Trump administration strategy going forward, this is sort of the yardstick that I use. You've got all the regional issues as well, and I think those come into the conversation. But if you're looking just at preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, those are the things you've got to pay attention to.
Strikes me that all three are right. The capacity to produce nuclear weapons clandestinely, the ability to weaponize the material and into a payload, and then, of course, the missile to deliver them are the three things you're looking for. How does the agreement help us at the moment deal with that particular set of issues?
So the agreement, one of its most innovative provisions is that it put, and Iran accepted, permanent inspection 24/7 on their uranium mining facilities, on their milling facilities, which is the first step after you mine the uranium, and on their centrifuge production facilities. And the first two in particular allow you to measure, since you can measure radioactivity down to the atomic level with great precision, you measure what's going in at the front end of the program, what's coming out of the ground and what is being milled, and you know what's coming out of their overt program. If the two don't match, you know there's a covert program somewhere. So one of the great strengths of this inspection regime is precisely that. And it's never talked about, and it's never been used before. And uranium mines and mills have never been inspected before, and it's one of the reasons why the Director General of the UN says this is the most robust nuclear verification regime in the world. It's not, and it is the case that the rate limiting step for proliferation is having fissile material, enough fissile material for weapons. So this is critical. And Iran has given up its, as part of the deal, its one plutonium production reactor, poured concrete into the core, and it will be redesigned. So I think we're pretty comfortable with the plutonium route being closed down. So the uranium route, as I just described, I think we're also pretty comfortable. The reason we have differences on the years is, first of all, it's confusing because in the deal, it's 10, 15, 20, 25, but we're 2 years in, so it's 8, 13, da, 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 da. So that's confusing. But the reason I use 13 is because the sunset provision on how much low-enriched uranium they are allowed to keep, 300 kilograms, is that one expires in 13 years from now. And that, again, that's the rate limiting step. Will you have enough? You can enrich 300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. It does not give you one critical mass. It doesn't give you one weapon. So that's why I use the, but one thing I think is useful to remind people is that arms control agreements are almost never indefinite. They're almost always, I know of, there's only two I can think of that were ever permanent at the beginning, and that was the biological weapons and the chemical weapons treaties. And the reason they aren't is because you're asking, countries are giving up military assets, and that's risky and scary and expensive in national security terms. And so they're written with time limits so that people can the parties can sort of moderate their risk. So it's worth reminding people that the key treaty here, the non-proliferation treaty, around which the whole global non-proliferation regime has been built and has been so successful, was originally only a 25-year commitment. And it wasn't until year 24 that the 200 by then state parties agreed to make it permanent. So that's one of the reasons why this agreement has time limits in it.
So just to respond to a couple of these things, Ivo, number one, I think that the difficulty with the sunsets in this question of limits is that the Iranian interpretation of the agreement is that their obligations are time limited, that their obligations sort of have these expiration dates on them, but that ours do not. And so I think one thing that you're seeing now from the Trump administration that you'll probably see from Congress is an effort to ensure that those time limitations are mutual, that basically they say, look, these restrictions on Iran may only last 8, 10, 13, 15 years, but that means that our obligation on sanctions relief should also only last that long, and our future sanctions behavior will depend on what Iran does after that period. To me, that would actually be more in keeping with this tradition of arms control treaties that Jessica's talking about, because certainly with the Soviets, we didn't agree that, okay, SALT I lasts 5 years. After that, Soviets can build all the nukes they want, and we promise we won't respond. That wasn't the paradigm, and it shouldn't be the paradigm now. On the sort of question of how does the agreement restrict or not restrict Iran's ability to do these three things that we talked about for building a nuclear weapon, I actually think that policymakers now are being relatively pragmatic in the way they look at these things. Of course, there's the political rhetoric on top of it, which we always have, which is rarely illuminating. But underneath that, I think they're looking at things like, okay, on fissile fuel production, What we don't want is we don't want to see Iran install in large numbers these advanced centrifuges. And so how do we push back on the possibility of that happening? That gets to the sunset clauses that you hear about so much. Could we lay down a marker that might deter Iran from taking that kind of step? When it comes to weaponization, Iran has engaged in weaponization activities in the past, so experiments on nuclear explosives and things like that. But what the agreement doesn't do is it doesn't basically have a provision for the IAEA to kind of go and follow those scientists or university labs or sites where that work took place. It essentially notes that work. Iran promises not to continue that work, but unlike many of the other elements of the agreement, there isn't a verification provision. So one of the big disputes now is what's the IAEA's role in going out and verifying that weaponization work hasn't continued. The Russians insist there is no role. The Iranians agree with that. What the United States would like, I think, is for the IAEA to be responsible for going and checking to see that that work hasn't been resumed. And then, of course, on the missile side of things, the agreement, the nuclear deal, not only doesn't restrict Iran's ability to, say, make an ICBM, what it does is it starts to lift, starting in 8 years from when the agreement was signed, the ability of other countries to help Iran with its missile program. And that's important because, as I'm sure both of you are aware, for Iran to build an ICBM would probably require outside help. It's not an easy technology to master. Other countries do have it. Some of those countries are Iran's closest international partners, like Russia, China, North Korea, maybe. They're certainly getting close if they don't have it already. And so stopping that, deterring that, is again one of the focuses, I think, now of American policy. And I should say, Ivo, I think that that would be a focus regardless of who is president. It's easy to make this a conversation about Donald Trump. I think that's in many ways missing the point, because I think this is a U.S. concern, not just a Trump concern, if you know what I mean.
So
Let me just say one thing.
Yeah.
Iran's most important commitments under this deal are permanent. They're not sunset. They made a permanent commitment under this deal not to have nuclear weapons and not to have nuclear weapons program, and to have a permanent commitment to this so-called additional protocol, which gives the IAEA its most important access. We don't know if that's provisional until 8 years from now, but those are the core commitments under the deal. They're permanent.
The reaffirmation of its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty,
go
and then further with the additional protocol as part of that on the inspections. Let's move forward to 2 weeks ago, and for those of you who may not have noticed, the president decided two things, very important things. One, he was going to stick with the deal as it existed today, at least for now. But secondly, he was no longer going to certify Iran's compliance with the deal, which is required not by the deal, but by an act of Congress that was passed at the time the deal was negotiated. And that sets in motion a 60-day clock for Congress to respond. So I want to tackle the issue at two levels. And first, I want to tackle the issue is from a tactical perspective. What was the president trying to accomplish by not certifying Iran's compliance under the act, but at the same time not walking away from the deal, which he has every right to do? What was he trying to accomplish? And then we can talk about how likely is it that what he was trying to accomplish will actually be accomplished.
Sure.
Michael, what?
So I should stipulate that I certainly don't speak for the Trump administration, but my understanding of what the president was trying to accomplish is there's probably two things at play there, and they're probably both true. One is there's a political purpose there. Obviously, President Trump, even before he was campaigning for president, made a big deal out of trashing the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, saying it was the worst agreement ever, saying it should be torn up, and so forth. He's obviously not done that, as you noted, Ivo. He said he's going to stick with the deal for now. So I think decertification, though, is a way to express his sort of, or maybe even follow through in a way on that campaign pledge to disavow this deal. I think
Without disavowing it.
Without actually disavowing it at this stage.
Yeah.
Second, and I think this actually relates to that kind of paradox, is there is now certainly, and there was before, I think, but there is now certainly a credible threat on the table that the president will walk away from this deal. He suggested alternately that he might walk away from it if he can't reach some kind of understanding with our allies over how to strengthen the deal. He suggested that he might walk away from it if Congress can't pass new legislation that sort of addresses the deal in some way. And I think that our allies and many others take those threats actually very seriously. And so if you're going into a negotiation or a discussion with allies, they may not be very happy about the president's policy, and I don't think they are very happy about it. But if they want to preserve the deal, they have to take very seriously the possibility that he could walk away and respond to that possibility. So I think those are the two things that you had going on there.
Jessica, how do you see it? Both
Well,
a political message and a tactical gaining
there's no
negotiating
question
leverage.
that he feels committed from the campaign. His rhetoric was very, very strong about, worst ever, one-sided, stupid, and more. And he has
sort of like
worked,
NAFTA and TPP and
the Cuba deal, and right.
yeah.
Paris Accord?
But here's the weird thing. Under the law, as you described, he has to do this certification every 60 days. Under the agreement, he has to continually waive sanctions on a slightly different schedule. For some strange reason, he objects to doing this domestic thing and doesn't object to doing the thing that actually has more consequences, which is continuing to waive the sanctions. If he weren't to do that, the deal falls apart instantly. We're in violation. I think, and I've talked to a lot of people who have been around, for some reason, certifying under the domestic law feels to him as though he is doing something that relates to President Obama. And he just refuses to do that. And it's been widely discussed and reported by people who were in the room in July when he had to do the last certification. He just spent 50 minutes of the 60 that the meeting lasted yelling at the staff and saying, I'm not going to do this again, regardless of what Iran is doing. And in the interim, his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense, his National Security Advisor, and his head of intelligence all said Iran was complying. So they were clearly trying to move a different direction. They were trying to preserve this thing while he was waiting for a different option. And so they spent these 3 months trying to come up with something that would thread a needle that between him not having to recertify for, I would say, sort of, well, for strange reasons, and pulling out of the deal completely. But you said that he did two things, that he was going to stick with the deal. That's not how I read the October 13th speech, because he said, Congress, you do this, basically unilaterally rewrite the thing, and if you don't, I'll end it later by myself. But I think it's also important to point out that, I think about the Cuba analogy here. Last June, he gave a big hair-on-fire speech. Same language, worst ever, one-sided, embarrassment, terrible. Was the Obama-Cuba deal, and said, so I am hereby, effective immediately, revoking it. But then he left the main pillars of the deal, at least so far, intact. And I think what his staff was looking for was a comparable opportunity, maybe, to do something that wouldn't do too much damage, but I would argue it has done a great deal of damage, without and hoping that then he would move on to something else, so that he would feel like he had fulfilled his campaign pledge. And I just want to say quickly one other word. The threat, and Secretary Tillerson in his on-the-record briefing to the press the night before said in these words, we're going to put some teeth in this thing, or else we might as well walk away from it and start over. It's not a question of starting over with our allies, who, by the way, hate that opportunity. It's not that they are not happy with it, they hate it. It's Russia and China and Iran. And the question is, what realistically is the likelihood that these 7 parties are going to sit back down at the table after thousands of hours of negotiating with us having just unilaterally walked away? It's a fantasy. And even if by some magic you could reconvene negotiations and you wanted more out of Iran than we got last time, what more would we be willing to put on the table to get it?
So this gets to Michael, to the core of the argument in some ways, which is whether this step provides the United States with leverage to address the problems that you identified earlier on, the 3 big issues, and if so, how? I mean, in some sense, it in part, if not in whole, is a political game that is done for domestic political reasons, because the essence, we're staying within the agreement with the threat that we can always walk away, which is a threat that existed before October 13th, because the president has the authority to walk away from this agreement under our Constitution. Where is the additional leverage coming from right now? And how do you, from a strategic perspective as opposed to political perspective, how are we going to get to that point?
So I should start by saying I think certification, decertification to me, and I said this before the decision was announced, is a bit of a tempest in a teacup. As Jessica noted, it really is a domestic requirement generated by this INARA bill, and whether you certify or decertify doesn't change your participation per se in the agreement. What's really important is our approach to the deal itself and our approach to that broader kind of set of questions about Iran. And I think one thing that's been lost in all of this is that one thing the Trump administration was trying to do by their explicit sort of, statement is to try to refocus everyone away from just the nuclear issue to that broader Iran policy. I think that hasn't worked because the nuclear issue ends up sucking all the oxygen out of the room, for better or for worse. And that's why I think we actually need a stable approach to this issue that can be sustained going forward so that we can talk about that wider set of issues. But look, I think at its core, what the Trump administration is trying to do here is relatively straightforward and ultimately, I think, if I understand it correctly, relatively pragmatic. And frankly, I'm always happy when politicians take pragmatic steps that are at odds with their political rhetoric. I never, as a foreign policy wonk, complain about that. I think what they're saying is, look, the Europeans are quite happy with the deal, but the Trump administration is not. At the same time, we know that the best option for us going forward is not to withdraw from the deal. So there is a bargain there to be had, which is if the Europeans would like us, if our allies would like us to remain in this deal, then let's forge a common front where we agree, number one, on how the deal is going to be implemented. So all those technical issues we were talking about before, whether it's small matters like what will our attitude be about verification of Iran's non-engagement in weaponization activities, to matters which are bigger like the sunset clauses. What will our joint attitude be about the sunset clauses, and can we put something down, sort of a marker down, so the Iranians are deterred from moving forward on some of these elements of their program, to those issues which are really outside of the deal, like cracking down on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, restricting Iran's ballistic missile program. So I think what they're doing is they're going to these allies and saying, we'll stay in the deal if you can agree with us on some set of policies on these issues so that we have this sort of united front. I think that fundamentally the allies won't object to that concept. I think the devil will be in the details. First, what are we asking for? What can the Europeans deliver? Because I think, for example, if we're asking for sanctions against the IRGC and missiles, which we obviously already have in place and which I think are entirely appropriate, you have 28 EU countries that would need to agree to those things. And they've shown so far, as you know very well, Ivo, that they have a very hard time getting agreement, even on what we would consider obvious steps, like designating Hezbollah as a terrorist entity, or acting against Iranian airlines like Mahan Air, which are involved in ferrying weapons and fighters to the front in Syria. But I think that's essentially the core of the policy. And I think, frankly, it is a sound policy approach. There's a congressional piece of it, too, which I think is less well understood. But I think what the congressional piece looks like is, can we have some kind of American policy coming from Congress, because, of course, the Trump administration will be out of office by the time we reach these sunsets, about what our policy will be towards those, towards the expiration of those restrictions in the future against Iran. And can we also change this certification requirement, which has proven so kind of destabilizing for policymaking, as we're seeing now. We're talking about it right now in part because of this certification requirement. Whether Congress can get that done, I don't know. I can't handicap Congress, but it would have to be bipartisan to get done because of that requirement that you have 60 votes in the Senate to move anything forward.
Jessica, what's wrong with that in the sense that you're trying to get the allies in the United States on a similar set of policy objectives, which, if we could agree, would presumably have more common approaches to the sunset issue? IRGC, maybe ballistic missiles, definitely big issue for the Europeans as well. They actually have missiles that can reach Europe today. Leaving apart, or not leaving apart the tactics, because the tactics are part of this, but why doesn't that work? Why isn't that a smart idea?
I don't think it's the right way you deal with people you call allies. 2, it's not what they're doing. 3, he has had an impact already on the political situation in Iran that is counter to U.S. interests. 4, he's given 2 nice gifts to Russia. It is a Russian priority to exacerbate and deepen transatlantic rifts. He's certainly done that, and the Russian connection in Iran is with the IRGC, and he has relatively strengthened the IRGC and its allies relative to the moderates by casting doubt on the deal and by insulting, gratuitous insults. We're getting used to it here. We don't like it, but we're getting used to it domestically. It does not play that way abroad. What it does is to bring all Iranian factions together. And if you read either the UN speech, General Assembly speech, or the October 13th speech, it is just littered with gratuitous insults to all of Iran. It achieves, not only does it not achieve anything, it hurts for what we want to achieve. It also, what he has done here is to open a dozen scenarios by which this thing falls apart. If that happens, China will step forward. China has stepped forward as we have stepped back in this administration on trade, on climate, on international development, but this will be the first time on national security. And I guarantee that will be, one of the consequences. And finally, and this is enormously important, it's probably the most important, he has put the word of the United States in doubt, in question. And that's never been the case before. Our word has been our bond. And once you do that, your ability to negotiate, deal in North Korea, anything, with friends or with adversaries, is diminished.
Michael, I'll give you a chance to respond, and then we're going to open it up to...
It's funny because I think that all of us, when administrations change over, administrations always start repudiating what the previous administration did.
It'd be nice if that didn't happen.
It'd be nice if it didn't happen. And we always bemoan it, but we especially bemoan it when it's the other party doing it, right? I mean, those of us who left the Bush administration were on the receiving end of plenty of complaints about the Obama administration and missile defense in Europe. It's probably an issue you're familiar with, Ivo. We were on the receiving end.
We got a better policy. So
they had a better policy. And I'm sure the Trump administration feels that it has a better policy here. And it's always the way. And I think that, Jessica gave us a litany of worries. And I think a lot of it, frankly, is the sort of thing you hear every time the administration's turning over and we sort of foreign policy people have this trauma of new policies being put in place. But I would point to different risks here. I think the number one risk is execution risk. This is going to require, if I've correctly described the Trump administration's strategy, and I can't claim sort of with perfect accuracy that that's the case, although it's my understanding, it's going to require delicate diplomacy with the Europeans. And the question, I think, is, can the Trump administration pull that off? Do they have the people in place to pull that off? And I think it'll be a real test for them. If they can pull it off, great. If not, then the risk is, after time goes by, will Congress really resist reimposing sanctions? Can you renew those sanctions waivers indefinitely without having, quote unquote, fixed the deal and so forth? The second risk, I think, is on the European side. As I said, can the Europeans, even if they want to, do enough to really respond to the Trump administration's calls for, say, sanctions on the IRGC and missiles and so forth? Is there really enough common ground there to be had? And then third, something that I worry about a lot is, does the United States actually have a clear strategy to counter Iran in the region? You know, it's one thing to say, well, unless you sort of sign up to our efforts to counter Iran in the region, we're going to walk away from the deal. But that's predicated on the notion that you have such a strategy. And right now, what I see in the Middle East, and it's important, I think, to widen the aperture a bit if we can, what I see in the Middle East is a very robust counter-ISIS strategy, but only a very vague notion of how we might push back on Iran's efforts to expand its influence, to project power, and so forth. And so before you can get others to agree with you, you have to know, what are you asking them to do? And I think there's a big question mark as to, do we really know what we're asking of the Europeans so that they can say yes? And right now, I don't know.
Can I just,
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to the speech, to the part about, and I'm here announcing a new Iran policy, there are 4 little bullets, each one about 1 line long, and none of them are new. And that's all there is on the so-called new Iran policy outside the deal.
I mean, I think, and this discussion helps, in my mind, clarifies something, that our ability to use the deal and play around with it in one way or another to have a wider impact on pressuring Iran is probably not the right way to go about it. Maybe improving the deal on the issues where the deal is supposed to be addressed may be the better course of action. Then we have to figure out tactically how to do that and come up with a separate policy for what is our policy towards Iran and to what extent can we actually do that with our allies. I think, Michael,
this by the way, Ivo, has exactly been the European reaction.
Yeah, I know,
and
I think I'm familiar with the Europeans, but it is, I mean, it is the issue of how much leverage can you gain by mucking around with our own domestic certification and or with threatening to get out of the deal on a larger set of issues when it isn't clear what you want to achieve on that larger set of issues, which I think is whereas it is clearer what you want to achieve in order to try to improve the deal. And then we can talk about the tactic of how to do that.
You have to, A, you have to be at the table, but B, and this is subtle, but it's really important, all the parties at the table have to agree, first of all, that no issue, no matter how small, should be, no violation should be swept under the rug. And there has to be confidence that when a country raises an issue in the Joint Commission, that it is doing it with the goal of strengthening the deal, not killing it.
Right.
And that has taken a hit.
No doubt. Let me open up the floor. We have about 15 minutes or so left. For those of you who are shy in asking questions and or are online, you can join us by going to chi.cnf.io and ask a question and or vote on one of the questions so that it comes up higher in the list and it's more likely to be asked. But let me go to the floor first.
Hi, thank you both for coming tonight for this enlightening and informative and really important discussion. We appreciate it. I have 2 questions. The first goes to the point that Jessica made earlier. the thing that we've been calling decertification is actually just a refusal to certify, which essentially is the president saying that the deal hasn't been complied with by the Iranians, even though it's universally agreed that it has been, and punting it to Congress based essentially on a lie. So I'm interested in particularly, Michael, in your reaction to this and the impact of this internationally on our ability to enter into any negotiations with anyone regarding anything, if we can essentially just make up a falsehood and change things through that falsehood, admittedly, not even pretending that it's something else. And then my second question is, what do you think?
Let's stay with the first
Sure.
question.
Okay.
Thank you.
So just to be clear on the decertification, I think the premise of your question is mistaken, and I'll explain why. The certification required that the Obama administration and the Trump administration certify 4 separate things. The first was whether Iran was fully implementing the deal. The second was Iran was not in material breach of the deal. That's what people think of as compliance, although it's actually a tiny bit different. Number 3 was, is Iran making advances in its nuclear weapons program without necessarily reference to the deal? Fourth was, it was almost 2-part. It was, is the sanctions relief we provided proportionate and appropriate given what Iran has done? And is the deal in the vital national security interests of the United States? And the Trump administration didn't choose to decertify on the basis of Iranian noncompliance with the deal. And they made clear in their comments that they weren't alleging that Iran had not complied with the terms of the deal. But they weren't saying there's a material breach of the deal. So the falsehood question doesn't come in. Where they were sort of taking issue with the deal was in this sort of the question of proportionality. Is the sanctions relief we've provided proportionate to what we've asked the Iranians to do? And that really ultimately is subjective. You could argue it is, we could argue it's not, and there isn't a sort of objective answer to that question. And so I think that, look, to the extent this affects other countries, what you hear from other countries well before this is they always worry about the impact of the American political system on the sort of stability of our foreign policies, right? And so there's 2 ways to look at this. So one way to look at this is that this is a case study in how politics can disrupt foreign policy. But it's also possible to look at this as a case of continuity because, in fact, you have President Trump despite having sort of promised to tear up the deal, has not done so. Just as President Obama, coming into office in 2009, January, in many ways continued the Bush administration's approach to Iran through sanctions, engagement in the P5+1 process, and even the threat of military force, which President Obama made time and time again. And so it's interesting when you actually look at the foreign policies of the United States over time and see these 2 different forces at play.
A question here that was submitted online, which is how might a potential U.S. withdrawal from the agreement affect relations with Europe and Middle East? We talked about that, but more importantly, how could parts of the deal remain intact? So if the U.S. walks away, and the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese and the or at least those first 5, the 3 Europeans, Russia and China, said, no, we don't, but we're sticking to the deal. How would that work? Could it work?
It could conceivably work. It seems unlikely, but it's possible. If it did, the U.S. obviously totally isolated internationally. As I said before, I suggested China will take advantage of the vacuum. And for 70 years, the United States has applied itself in both Republican and Democratic administrations to building a rules-based international order. That has been our purpose, and it has been steady through all kinds of administrations. This would be, I think, a major step away from that. We reached an agreement. It was not perfect, but was, I think, a fairly extraordinary achievement given where Iran was in its in its development. And given how little trust there was and how much water had been under the bridge, we approved it. It is so far working, and then we walk away.
Just to the technical basis for it, there's two possible outcomes you'd see if the United States decided to withdraw. And withdraw here is a kind of casual term because there's no real sort of provision for withdrawal in this agreement. If we chose to take some sort of complaint about Iranian compliance to the Joint Commission, which is set up under the deal, it could lead to the deal falling apart, to all the UN Security Council resolutions which had been enforced coming back. This deal was designed so that there's a reverse veto process. It's actually quite innovative in that regard, where even if Russia, China, and the UK and France opposed it, we could force those sanctions to come back. The other option is we could simply stop complying with it without taking that step, without bringing any complaint about Iran before the Joint Commission, in which case it depends what Iran and the other parties decide to do. My guess, based upon what the Iranians have said, is that they would try to remain in the agreement, in part because what this agreement does for the Iranians on a practical level is it restores trading relations with the European Union, which is very important for Iran. And you could make a sort of argument from the Iranian perspective in that scenario that, hey, well, why don't we try to isolate the United States diplomatically and maintain good relations with the EU, Russia, and China by staying in the agreement, whereas if you start ramping up your nuclear program, even if the EU is angry at the United States, they can't ignore the nuclear threat. They've shown that before. Whether Iran would actually take that kind of pragmatic decision, who knows? They have politics as well, and some may see it as a chance to ramp up the nuclear program. My guess is not, but it's hard to say.
Let's go back to the room. Sir, here in the third row.
I was wondering if you could comment on your views of the NPT surviving in the current environment, both from the standpoint of what happens in the Middle East if the U.S. withdraws and also what's happening in North Korea with the potential for South Korea and Japan developing their own capabilities.
Well, I don't see a direct threat to the NPT in what's happening now. I've always believed that the biggest threat from Iran having nuclear weapons, I never believed that they were likely to start a nuclear war with us, is that the history is that proliferation always happens in clumps, right? You never have sort of one country at a time. The US gets it, then Russia gets it, then China gets it. In connection to that, India goes because China went, Pakistan goes because India went. Brazil and Argentina went over the line together and then stepped back together. It always is in clumps. And I've always believed that the likely consequence of Iran going nuclear was that you were likely to have Saudi Arabia. And at that time, I mean, now Egypt is in much more financial trouble, but possibly Egypt, possibly Turkey. And you would have a very different Middle East. You would also have, I mean, one of the amazing things that people, it's hard to remember about the NPT is that in 1960, experts believed there would be about 30 nuclear powers in the year 2000. And we now have 9. Whether you count nuclear weapons countries, countries with nuclear programs, or countries thinking about going nuclear, the number has gone down steadily over these ensuing decades. It has been a huge international success. This was really the first instance where a country was perhaps, and we don't know and probably never will, going to violate it had violated many commitments, but the great big one was it going to go nuclear, was addressed through diplomacy. And if it's not finished, we all know the weaknesses in the agreement and what needs to be built on top of it. But it was a major achievement. But I even if it goes down, I think the NPT itself is solid.
I think that one thing that we could hope coming out of all of this, not just the nuclear agreement itself, but the reaction to the nuclear agreement, is a strengthening of global non-proliferation norms. And why do I say that? The agreement itself does one important thing with this respect, and that's the NPT has an obligation for states not to pursue, for non-nuclear weapon states, not to pursue nuclear weapons, but it doesn't really flesh that out in any detail. So there is this Section T of the Iran nuclear agreement, which actually starts to specify what is nuclear weapons work. That's useful, but it doesn't really go far enough from my point of view. Number one, because we have to establish that the IAEA can verify those obligations, and that's one thing which is really sort of cutting edge debate right now. But also, I think we need to go further and say, how do we limit these fuel cycle activities, which have proliferated around the world, even if nuclear weapons have not, because they're inherently dual use, and we don't want to see them proliferate. This was something that was on the table during the Bush administration. I think it needs to get back on the non-proliferation agenda so that in the best case scenario, if this agreement sort of survives, is strengthened and survives, what we want is that by the time it expires, we have strengthened the global non-proliferation regime so that Iran and others are faced with a more restrictive global environment and not just these kind of bespoke agreements which we've been relying upon in the past 20 years or so.
Just want to add one point, which is that undergirding the NPT and both as an agreement and technical definitions is, in my view, the greatest non-proliferation policy the U.S. has pursued, in addition to the NPT, is the creation of alliances, which have provided through a nuclear and security guarantee an incentive for countries to say, in return for that guarantee, we will forgo nuclear weapons. And the reason we're having a debate in Asia, and for the first time in Europe since, in Germany in particular, since the early 1970s, about maybe we should rethink this, is because there is a doubt about the alliance system. So you play around with allies at your own peril. And part of what we were worried about the 10 and 15 nuclear weapons by 1975 and the 30 nuclear weapon states by the year 2000, was that our allies would go nuclear. And indeed, Japan and Germany were very late to the agreement on nonproliferation. They only did so in 1970. Even though the agreement was signed in 1968, because they weren't willing to give up that option until they were really sure that the United States was going to be there as their ally.
Right. Let me endorse that wholeheartedly and say that this is one reason, among many, why alliances can't just be viewed transactionally. There are these positive externalities we get from alliances, and one of them is this non-proliferation effect.
We have time for one more question. We'll go the gentleman right here in the third row.
Based on the things that you all have talked about regarding the importance of strategic alliances, regarding other countries being able to count on the word of the United States, can you talk about what you think are some of the long-term effects from, for now we have 9 or 10 months now, not really hearing a whole lot of truth from the podium in the press room, and really not hearing a whole lot of truth from the actual president himself? What are the long-term issues and damage to relationships, strategic alliances, other people taking the United States at their word for something that might happen years and years from now?
So we have a lightning round. Just in 30 seconds, Jessica's already laid out a number of points, but in 30 seconds, what do you worry about most as a consequence? And let's keep it to the Iran deal and within the context in terms of its implication globally, in answer to this question.
Well, if it's limited
in a generic sense and as an example too.
The question has to do with, I would just say two things. The U.S. interest in and commitment to international problem solving, multilateral agreements, and its word. I mean, the two things are intimately connected. But look at what we've done in 9 months, right? We've walked away from two very important international trade deals, the Asia-Pacific one and the European one. We've walked away from the Paris Climate Agreement. We've walked away from NAFTA. We have walked away over and over again from agreements that were largely our doing. And so, you know, what does that mean for the future of international problem solving when more and more problems are international?
So, look, I'll say, the United States isn't perfect. I know that very well. But I think that American leadership, including American moral leadership, is incredibly important for the world, for the stability we see, for the maintenance of international order, for the maintenance of peace in the world. And I think that there's good reasons for us to want to maintain that leadership, even at a cost. And there is a cost. But there's a benefit, which I think which outweighs that cost tremendously. And that means that, look, sometimes you need to change policy. Sometimes you need to change course. But I think if you need to, you've got to go out and you've got to build a coalition. You've got to go out and make the persuasive effort and get others behind you, because there's no doubt that in this case and in many other cases, having an alliance behind us, being able to confront a country like Iran or North Korea or any other country that we consider an adversary with a united front with our allies, we're much more powerful. And then we don't have to do everything ourselves, which is something that we're trying to get away from as well. Look, I don't think that this is a problem that arose just today, although we certainly see it coming out very strongly today. I think that foreign policy in general has become politicized, has become partisan over the past, 10, 15 years in a way that I think is damaging to our ability to exercise our leadership on the world stage. I think having your domestic coalition behind you is important to being able to go out and get that international coalition. And so what I hope is that presidents and policymakers of both parties will take a lesson from these episodes and say, look, you got to have your domestic coalition behind you, and that then gives you leverage, hopefully, to go out and play that leadership role on the world stage, get your allies behind you, and confront adversaries in a much more effective way.
We always focus in leadership on the question of who's in the driver's seat. But what's really important is whether there's anybody in the back seat. Because when you lead and no one follows, you have a problem of leadership. And I think that's one of the big issues here. I think we all agree here that American leadership is important and a good thing and something that we ought to stick to and stick with. Michael, Jessica, thank you really very much for an enlightening discussion of an important topic. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ivo.